feeling out like what the potential of a relationship is, feeling out what a partner's potential buy-in is, figuring out your own company's intentions behind pursuing a project, and then sort of responding and operating and prioritizing accordingly.
Hey everyone, this is John.
And this is Veronica.
Welcome to the third week of the John and Veronica show. For those of you who weren't with us last week, we'll describe a little bit about what the show is about. For us, we are currently lucky and privileged to work in the entertainment, media, and technology space. Industries covered include, gaming, film, video, music, sports, and there's just so much. And our show focuses on demystifying how to get in and what it's like to work in these fields through the people who work there. And when I say people, I mean people who in the middle of their careers. They are not CEOs yet, so they still remember how they got in, and they are now managing teams and functions. And Veronica, do you want to add anything to that?
No, just that I think, this all started because you and I like talking to people in general and like talking to people who know and love their craft. But it's also, for me personally, it took actually getting out into the workforce to even know what kind of jobs are available in it. So the hope is to talk to the people who are actually doing the work and to hear what it's like, kind of like having a friend in the biz, and learn how they broke in and how you could too. And it's so funny, every time you say entertainment, media, technology, or EMT, I just kept thinking like EMT, it's dynamite. So I just needed to exercise that demon so that we can move along. That's all I got.
Perfect. Well, let's get into the fun part of this, which is our guest today, Dontae Rayford. I've known Dontae for almost 10 years. Let's just count it as 10 years now. And I like to describe him as, it's kind of corny, but as a Renaissance man person, because he's just done so many variety of things. In terms of his day job, he's done business development at all sorts of technology companies, small to large, including Google, IFT, you're going to have to help me pronounce these names, eTechnologies, TuneIn, and now Verizon Media. But also, on top of all that, he's also worked in politics, in California State Assembly. He was a commissioner of student aid. That's kind of curious. I got to ask him about that. He's done social media. He's been an adjunct professor. So there's just so much to talk about. Let's just get started. Veronica, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here, Dontae, first of all. Cheers.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Well, you've done so many different kind of things, but I know that today we wanted to hone in on business development. And I wonder, sometimes we like to start by just looking at things from 60,000 feet, really broad strokes. What is business development? How would you define it?
No, that's a good question. And I get this question quite a bit, random outreach on LinkedIn and whatnot. But I typically start with saying what it's not, right? And so a lot of people have this idea of, if you work in business, which is a very nebulous concept, there's so many different functions within that. But if you work in business and you're negotiating deals, you're sitting across the table from a partner with lawyers, and it's this very contentious, confrontational type of environment. And that's not what the job is, right? In my experience, I've been doing this exclusively since finishing business school, and that's only happened a couple of times, right? Most of the negotiations are handled asynchronously. You're sending emails back and forth. You're figuring out how do you bottom out on different sticking points that you and your teams may have. But it's not that intense negotiation class type of experience that a lot of folks are led to believe that it is. But when I think about business development, it is, typically if you go on a career website, you'll typically see it bucketed alongside sales because it's not too far removed from that. So when I think about BD, it just depends on where you fall on the partnership time horizon, right? So if you're looking at short term, I would consider that to be more traditional sales where you have a defined product and you're taking it to market and you try to exchange value in the near term, typically within the quarter. Then you start to think about medium to long term. Medium term could be a blend of that traditional sales role and creating new products, visions, value, et cetera. And then long term, that's when you really start to think about strategic relationships, right? So how do we get together with another partner or set of partners to make 1 + 1 = 3, so to speak, which is cliche, but you're trying to define new things that you can do together to drive incremental value or protect value that you might be losing from your business. So I really like to focus in on those time horizons to differentiate between what I do on the BD side and what traditional sales might look like.
That's great because what's interesting for me doing this show is that the first week our guest he works in sales. So just seeing how when you're covering all these different functions and hearing it from different experts in each field to see how it ties together. Since I've never worked in sales before and I'm relatively newish to BD, I've only done it for a couple years. When I approach these areas or functions, I think of them more as like siloed. Whereas I like the approach you're giving, which is like the broader landscape of things. So following up on everything you just said, what does the day to day look like for your job? You kind of mentioned a lot of stuff is asynchronous. You send emails. What does a Wednesday morning look like for you?
It varies quite a bit. I think one of the things that kind of drew me to this work initially was my first stint at Google. I was working in operations, I was working in sort of traditional sales before going to business school. But I remember getting exposure to the product management function. And so it's kind of a weird journey for me where I saw product managers and I didn't say, hey, I want to become a product manager because there's plenty of awesome stuff associated with that role, but plenty of things that I wouldn't want to do or be able to do. Um, but instead, I saw the role that product managers played in sort of charting the course for technology businesses, right? And I said, what is something that I can do and that would allow me to leverage my skill set to further some of those objectives, right? And one thing that I can say is, you get these stereotypes. If you're technical in nature, you might be introverted or socially awkward or whatever. Well, I study sociology in undergrad, right? So all about people, all about relationship management, even with the experiences working in politics. And so I said, hey, if I could be aligned with these sort of forward thinking folks within the organizations I work at and use my skill set to some extent to advance those causes and create new value and really help to achieve these sort of strategic objectives for companies, that was extremely appealing to me, right? So when I came back from business school, I went back to Google after business school, that table that I wanted to sit at, I found myself sitting at, right? And sort of playing a really key and integral role in that. So that was super rewarding for me. So a lot of what I do on a typical Wednesday, coming back to your question, is understanding like what are the different sets of priorities that my key internal stakeholders have, and then what is it that I can be doing to sort of advance some of those initiatives that they're looking to push into the market. And that could be scouting out new potential partners, that could be figuring out ways to expand a relationship with the existing partners, and in some cases, being the mouthpiece for communicating to partners that a relationship isn't working out, right? So it's the full spectrum there, and the sort of standard activities are going to change on a day-to-day basis.
You mentioned your skill set a few times in there. And I wonder, from your perspective, what do you see as the key skills that you need to have for business development? What's in your tool belt?
Good question. So before I actually started working in the BD role, I just assumed like, well, if I'm not technical, I need to, crunch numbers in Excel and become like a super modeler. Went to business school, did that, came back into a BD function, and one, I'm not that great at building models, but two, what I found is that for most of the companies I've worked at, they've got entire departments dedicated to doing that. So when I think about my skill set, it is um, relationship management, like trying to assess and understand the risk profile of different opportunities. And obviously, lawyers are more acutely aware of what those are, but feeling out like what the potential of a relationship is, feeling out what a partner's potential buy-in is, figuring out your own company's intentions behind pursuing a project, and then sort of responding and operating and prioritizing accordingly, right? So that's probably more art than science, but I do think it takes a certain type of skill set to try to weave together all of those things and make all of the trains run on time. So that's one piece. I would say the other piece is really, it's not so much a skill set, but it is just sort of like a level of awareness, right? Like when you do or don't have leverage in a relationship that you're pursuing with a partner or an existing relationship. I see one of my buddies, Chris, is in the audience here. We spent the better part of 2020 together trying to determine if we had internal leverage, meaning do we have support internally to go execute on these partners that we know we can execute against. But if there's not full buy-in, then these things might not be fully successful. So you need to, have starts and stops based on whether or not you think you can get the best deal for you and your teams, or whether or not you think you can get a deal across the finish line that's going to be positioned for success.
Really being able to, I mean, you talk about the social dimensions and the intellectual dimensions, being able to read the room and kind of see the realities of the situation, knowing where your partner is coming from.
100%. And I would add to that quickly. It's like I kind of cringe when I think about it, but you a lot of times you hear these expressions around like hiring someone or even working with a partner. It's like, would I have a meal with them? Would I get a beer with them? Those are loaded concepts because not everyone is going to fit certain molds, and obviously I don't. But the idea is, can you build relationships with people and find things to connect on beyond just like the immediate task at hand? Because we may strike out 3 or 4 times trying to find a partnership that works. But if I like what you're doing as a colleague and what your company is doing, maybe it's going to be the fourth or fifth time where we take a crack at it and we find something that really is a breakthrough opportunity.
That is a great point because my last role was on the deal slash partnership side, and some of those deals happened because I worked with them in a previous company or at a previous role within Amazon. And now that I've left, there's opportunities even at my next opportunity too. So I like the concept of like building this relationship across, your just during the entire duration of your career. Um, so you just talked about skills, and that brings me to a point that's kind of near and dear to my heart, which is especially for folks who've gone to, let's say, business school. There's always this whole debate at probably even business schools today about being a specialist versus a generalist. And high level thought that I've had was that it seems like right now in this day and age, you have a high chance of, breaking into the C-suite if you are specializing in one area, like one function. And then some people try a different route, and they have mixed results as well. So given that your career has been pretty, it seems like you've been thoughtful about your career. Is this like on purpose that you've designed it in a way where you're kind of just become like a master in one domain?
Not so much, right? I think I found a function that I enjoy first and foremost, and I think that is kind of, in a sense, the way that I specialize. But when we think about the larger backdrop against which I'm operating, I've pivoted quite a bit, right? And I think traditionally, a lot of my mentors when I was younger would say, find this path and stick with it. Like, in the 2008 2009 period, everyone was like, well, you really need to specialize in mobile because mobile is going to be big, right? If you can imagine a world before smartphones existed. And then you fast forward to today, and like mobile is everything, right? And so if I could specialize in a certain type of technology, then you fast forward to today, and they say every company should be a technology company, even coming from traditional industries. So I wouldn't say that I've specialized in a certain type of technology, and I also wouldn't say that I specialize in a certain type of deal. Sometimes I've done deals that are cost-based deals where we're licensing something in or paying for rights to some other product or service. And then it's always fun when you can do deals that are generating new incremental revenue, right? So, um, I would definitely consider myself to be more of a generalist, and with that, I think comes over time perspective, and I would like to think some degree of creativity and comfort with navigating ambiguity, to kind of tip my hat to drinking the Google Kool-Aid back in the day. But taking a very fast pace, sort of continuously changing landscape in front of you and the teams you're working on, adapting to that quickly, and then sort of taking lemons and making lemonade type of concept.
Right. How do you strike the balance between doing a certain kind of thing long enough to develop a familiarity or a comfort or an expertise with the fact that your industry itself is changing so rapidly and you want to stay agile and you need to be constantly learning and absorbing?
Bingo, spot on.
John, when you started asking that question, you were sort of you alluded to breaking into the C-suite one day and a path to get there. I wonder for business development, what's the C-level role that corresponds? Is it, chief revenue officer, chief business officer? Help me out.
Yeah, I found it to not be as direct, right? I've been, privileged to have some of the leaders that I've worked under go on to the C-suite, and it can take on a number of forms. Yeah, obviously, it can be CEO if folks are assuming the reins at an existing company or starting their own. Chief operating officers, it's not uncommon for them to sort of manage the business development or partnerships team within an organization. And then for smaller, fast growing companies, you might see titles like chief revenue officers, chief growth officers. And a lot of times those functions are focused on how do we look outside of the company for opportunities to expand, get additional distribution, additional customer acquisition, et cetera. So, they're probably, unless you have a core financial background, you're probably not going to be a CFO. Uh, Unless you have a technology skill set, you're probably not going to be a CTO. But I think a lot of the different functions in that C-suite can be accessible for folks who have enough experience and have a pretty broad-based perspective around what makes a business go and what can make a business successful.
That brings me to another good point that you made to me a couple weeks ago, which is there's definitely like the functional skills, right? Whether it's hard skill, soft skill, or life skill, whatever you want to call it. And then what you said last time to me, which really resonated with me, was this concept of what is your calling card going to be? So for me, I'm basically gaming plus creators. Uh, what about you? Because I know you've got lots of personal and professional interests. You've kind of dabbled into, different types of technologies, voice assistants, smart interfaces. What do you think your calling card's going to be?
That's a good question. I don't exactly know. I think I do want the calling card to be like, hey, can the versatility to advance the objectives of companies at different stages. But again, I really haven't focused on a sector in that way. And again, in the long term, I don't know if that's going to be a distraction or hurt me in some way. But I think I've really enjoyed sort of the diversity of subject matter that I've been able to traverse since entering this world, spanning from augmented and virtual reality when I went back to join Google, traditional hardware distribution and licensing deals, and just a bunch of if we were like a digital Internet of Things type of automation company. So uh, maybe my calling card could be like, hey, the capacity to work on cutting edge technologies and really help to scale them. Because a lot of these companies you go into, you can see why they may be suffering with certain product areas from having them achieve mainstream adoption. And maybe it is playing a small role in saying like, how do you translate really cool technologies into practical use cases that mainstream folks like my mom can actually utilize instead of nerds like me, sitting in my house tinkering with all of these new random things. So I think that's something that kind of means a lot to me. I don't know if that would be my calling card at this point, but that is sort of a common theme that I've used when I'm deciding like what type of work do I want to do, what type of organizations do I want to be a part of.
I think when we talk about calling cards, right, there's so much of an element of personal branding. You think like, oh, what's the signal that I'm sending out into the world or how I want to brand myself or market myself? Maybe another way to look at it is, when you're a generalist, your through line is not so much the specialist set of skills, but there might be other through lines that you see even retroactively emerging throughout your career that were kind of unexpected, maybe, or oh, I realize as I look back on all the different kinds of jobs I've had, they've all had this thing in common, or I've really enjoyed this element of them. I don't know if anything jumps out at you particularly like that.
No, I think Veronica was really well said. So, not to answer your question directly, but when people think about me as a person who works in business, like if anyone ever applies that moniker, traditionally I was brought up with the sense of like go into a profession with a very clear linear path into what you're going to do, right? So if you go to law school, you will practice law. If you go to med school, you'll become a doctor, so on and so forth. But when you think about someone who goes to business school, um, what do they do after, right? There's no accreditation test that you take after graduating with an MBA, and there's no defined type of company or function that you will operate in once you've acquired that MBA. And so I think like inherently a little bit of the sort of educational training has made me a generalist, and that's been sort of the through line with the work that I've done. It's like if I see a problem that I believe that I'm capable of contributing to a solution for, like how can I bring that skill set to bear in disparate and different types of environments that I might be working in.
The purpose of this podcast is to help people who are potentially entry level or career switchers. And one question I think a lot of people have from the outside of the BD function ask is like, how do you break into BD? Do you need to have like a law degree? And how does that fit with other like lawyers on the team? Are lawyers BD, or how does it all work together?
Good question. So on the law degree piece first, no, you definitely don't need a law degree. I've had a number of colleagues who started off as commercial attorneys, meaning like actively drafting the contracts that are being negotiated, and getting those across the finish line. And then they find out that they have an affinity for the process outside of just drafting, right? They might enjoy negotiating or working through sticky issues with partners, and so they may make that transition, right? But functionally, if they sit in the BD org, there's probably still going to be a legal counterpart who's responsible for drafting. So that's not a requirement. I would also say that an MBA is not a requirement, right? Like there are opportunities very early in your career or in the middle of your career where you can transition into that type of role. I've seen a lot of folks go from an account management or partner management type of function into more proactive, external facing, developing new business alongside those same partners and accounts that they were managing. That's one path. So typically, you know, be in companies that you want to work for, and find a way into those organizations. And it might be through a function that you don't have intentions of staying in long term. But if you're building those relationships externally and internally, I think you'll often find that there will be opportunities that emerge. Assuming your company's doing well, you're growing, there are opportunities there. You'll find some of these openings will emerge, and you'll have an opportunity to speak to what your transferable skills are, right? And I don't think anything is more powerful than this idea of I am partner ready, meaning the company trusts me to be external facing. They don't just put me into a cubicle and tell me to keep my head down. And if you find that, in the beginning you're shy or you're timid or you're not partner ready, then find someone you can shadow, right? Like, and figure out how you can get that exposure and start to build up that skill set and work through those, start to exercise those muscles that you may not have had the opportunity to leverage in the past, until you get to a point where you think or feel like, hey, I'm ready to take on this challenge. Even if I'm not 100% equipped to do so, maybe I'm 90% there, and I'll learn the rest of the 10% on the fly. That's an option that a lot of folks have. So I always say to folks, even if I hadn't gone to business school, I would have found my way into BD one way or another. It could have been leaving Google to go to startup. It could have been being in the right place at the right time at Google, or even sort of finding into one of these opportunities at another large company. So there are multiple paths in, and it's just as nebulous as like what I was alluding to earlier. What do you do when you graduate with an MBA? Whatever you want to do to some extent, and whatever you feel like you can piece together a strong enough story for a hiring manager to say, yes, this person can help advance the objectives of my team.
Well, I love it. I feel like a theme of the conversation, right, is one a specialist, is one a generalist, is the career on a track that's sort of fixed where you're leading, or are you navigating ambiguity, are you in this nebulous situation? And it's interesting where it seems like going to business school or being in business development puts you in the mindset of creating that opportunity for yourself, or thinking almost in a vacuum about what opportunities are. And then it helps you also create those kind of opportunities for whatever business you embed in. Not to end a sentence with a preposition.